This one is from Chloe Hopkins. Hello, Chloe.
Hello. I wanted to ask about rail, because the government's just announced more funding for the Transpennine route, and apparently it's going to be once again part of the Northern Powerhouse. Love that that's still a thing, and yet we don't see that much change in the north in terms of the changing the divide. But I also want to say, as we're here in Bridlington, are we ever going to see politicians actually focus as much on local train routes and improving the local and regional routes as they do on connecting cities? Most of the time it's about like connecting places to London, which is annoying enough. But even when you're looking at like what's going on in the north, it's going, let's connect the northern cities to each other, not how can we improve the rail as a whole.
Thank you for that, Chloe. So yeah, the government said the other day that there'd be an extra £317 million invested into the Transpennine route and upgrading it. Looking at the information they churned out, there seemed to be an emphasis on connections between York, Leeds and Manchester. And perhaps not unconnected to that, I was just looking at the train timetable, which you guys here in this room will be very familiar with. If you want to go from Bridlington to York, a distance of 41 miles, it'll take 2 hours by train. Jack Blanchard.
Well, this is a subject close to my heart. I used to work for the Yorkshire Post back in the day, and we had a campaign about 10 years ago when I was there, all about demanding more regional funding for the area and all about demanding better rail links and also better bus links, which is a thing that nobody ever talked about, but is really important, and it's actually how quite a lot of people get around. And we got lots of warm words from the government. I remember David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time, and he always wanted to be seen up in Yorkshire saying, yes, we're going to do more. And he definitely announced big things for the Transpennine rail route, some of which happened, some of which still haven't happened nearly 10 years later. And I'm afraid it just feels like the same old cycle. There are different ways that governments talk about this. We now have levelling up as the latest sort of buzzword, but I'm afraid it feels a little hollow for so many towns around the north that, as you say, only see ever real investment going into big cities and big city connections. And a lot of that is to do with the way the Treasury assesses these projects and looks for what it thinks is where the biggest economic gains are, because that's where the critical mass of people are. And maybe there's very good reasons when you add up the numbers as to why that is, but it leaves a lot of people in a lot of parts of the country feeling completely left out. And I'm afraid I haven't heard anything from this government that makes it look like that's going to change.
Timandra Harkness.
I think, it's absolutely gone on for years and years and years, hasn't it? Public transport outside London just gets completely neglected, and if you don't have a car or a motorcycle or some other independent transport, it just takes you ages to get anywhere at all. And I can't help feeling, it's great that they're talking the talk. I don't know, is 317 million a lot for trains? I suspect it isn't. No. I don't know what it costs per mile now to put down new rail, let alone actually keep trains running, but it doesn't sound like it's going to go very far. But I kind of feel there's a bit of a pincer movement here where public transport continues to be neglected and underfunded if you're outside a big city, and especially London. But there's also increasingly a squeeze on private motor vehicles in the name of the environment, but it's great to talk about we're all going to get electric cars, but until we have loads more electricity and suddenly a network of charging points everywhere and we can all afford 30 grand for an electric vehicle, I can't see that happening. I worry that just the idea that mobility is a good thing and a needful thing for human life and for employment and for family links and culture and all the important things about human life is increasingly downgraded, and the idea that what we should all do is stay within a mile of our homes is the future. So I know this doesn't help as a practical proposal for better trains, but I would just like to say human mobility is a good thing, an important thing, and we should stand up for it.
David Davis.
Yeah, more than a couple of years ago now, David Cameron was Prime Minister, but several years ago, there was a quite fierce argument inside the Conservative Party. Those like me who didn't like spending vast amounts of money on HS2 and wanted to spend the money on smaller, more local projects. And we had a contest, we had a competition looking around the country to see how we could spend the money that was going on HS2, or the best estimate of it, elsewhere. And one of the projects, for example, was a York to reinstate the York to Beverley line, and it was massively popular, you know. And we didn't win the argument with Cameron, but you're beginning to win it now, and you see the local MPs and so on that line wanting it and encouraging it. And I think the 370 million isn't very much. I think it's just a down payment. There's a lot more that's got to come there, and it should focus not on the cities, actually, not Leeds and Manchester, but on the towns, because that's where the future of our country is, in the towns. And being able to not just go to work, but go shopping, frankly, by rail, will be the sort of thing I'd like to see in the future in Yorkshire.
Do you accept, David Davis, that HS2 is going to happen, given how much has now been ploughed into it?
Yeah, but I mean, at the risk, certainty of making myself very unpopular with the Treasury, I think it's going to cost twice as much and take twice as long as people assume. And that's, just for the numbers, that's £200 billion. And I think you could do an awful lot of local rail development for that money. Because what HS2 will do is it will eventually increase the speed of travel between London, Birmingham, Manchester, but actually it will lead to more concentration of business and economics in the southeast, not in the north. I remember when the York-London train dropped below 2 hours, I think it was 1:49. And what happened was you get people now commuting from York to London. You were trying to, the members of the cast were trying to get the train up to York to come from, and they couldn't get a place because it's full of people commuting weekly from York to London. What these big, fast rail networks will do is move more of the economy south. We want to move it north.
Thank you, David. Just looking at the numbers, the government says it's spent more than £29 billion on transport across the north of England since 2010. Angela Eagle, you represent a constituency on the other side of the Pennines. I'm trying to think how long it would take to get from here back to your patch. Quite a while.
You certainly do a tour, and you
Angela,
do go on
dear
the
listener,
ludicrous...
is waving her hands around to gesticulate it's not a straight line.
You go on the rather ludicrously named Trans-Pennine Express, because the express bit of it doesn't really accord with what happens, and you do go all around the houses, and it's very beautiful, but it's not fast. I agree with Jack that buses are really, really important, and they're often not talked about, and it's much easier to get bus journeys on faster and quicker than having to invest in rail lines and trams and all sorts of very capital expensive things. So I would make a plea for doing more about buses. I think the key to this is actually taking power down to local areas and giving local areas much more power to initiate and invest in their own local infrastructure. Now, we have seen the beginnings of that starting. Over in Merseyside, we have Mersey Travel, and they got fed up of being given. They've got this thing called where they actually cascade rolling stock down, they call it. That means we get 40-year-old trains from London. And they got so fed up of that they've now invested themselves in brand new trains. We're just getting new trains, but it's taken a lot of time to do it. We should be handing those powers down. And it's always been policy in our party to hand powers down so that local communities and local areas can actually get together and fix their broken transport networks, and they know what they need, and the Treasury ought to be funding it.
Thank you.